The question now being raised is how President Biden will fare against his challengers, particularly Republican frontrunner, former President Donald Trump. Joining us now to break it all down is Marc Caputo, national political reporter for The Messenger, and Julia Manchester, the national political reporter at The Hill. Marc, I'd like to start with you. Just 5% of Americans want a rematch of Biden versus Trump. The vast majority tell pollsters the idea makes them exhausted and fearful. And yet, sitting here today, it's looking like that might be the matchup.
Yeah, well, welcome to the American political system. You know, most Americans hate Congress, but for some reason always reelect, or usually reelect their congressman or congresswoman. So far, this is the result of the party system, the primary system we have. I don't want to declare Donald Trump the winner of the Republican primary. Ron DeSantis, Florida's governor, has yet to even declare. But so far, it's looking like Trump. And yes, so far, it's looking like a pretty historic rematch. We haven't had anything like this since, last century, or pardon me, the 1800s.
Right.
When I think Grover Cleveland
ran for
re-election. Yes, so against Benjamin
You know
Harrison.
your history, Marc.
Right.
But just on that for a moment, a Wall Street Journal poll does show that Biden would narrowly defeat Trump, but that DeSantis would narrowly beat Biden. You're down in Florida. The problem right now is that DeSantis has had a rough few weeks. He's trailing Trump right now. Marc?
I'm sorry, I got a little interference there in my earpiece.
Interference, no worries. Julia, why don't you jump in and we'll let Marc weigh in a second.
Yeah, look, Republicans have a primary problem when it comes to Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump. Look, you have DeSantis, like you said, Elizabeth, leading in, behind Trump in a number of these primary polls. But when he goes up against Joe Biden, he ends up defeating him versus Donald Trump, who is simply ahead in these primary polls but can't compete with Joe Biden. I think Republicans are going to have to go on a messaging offensive, not only in this race, but also in other primaries, whether that's in the House or the Senate, to get their voters to elect the electable candidate that will perform well in the general. So, we'll see if this happens at the presidential level. Look, I think former President Trump, even though he's technically not an incumbent, he has the power of the incumbency in a way because he wasn't president that long ago. He has a large platform. And Ron DeSantis is still relatively young. He's still relatively new to the political scene. So it's going to take some time for him to get his footing and really to grow his name ID.
Marc, you're an expert on Florida politics, all things Florida. I mean, can DeSantis bounce back from his pretty awful week?
Well, I mean, those are two separate questions, right? I mean, there's one thing is he had an historic win in Florida in his re-election in 2022.
Yeah.
The other question is once Ron DeSantis decides to run for president and once he announces what happens, well, that's kind of anyone's ball game. Now, the smartest minds on both the Republican and the Democratic side say, look, Donald Trump is the man to beat in the Republican primary. The polls show it, and if you talk to voters just individually, that's what they will tell you. So it's going to be incumbent on Ron DeSantis to really hit the campaign trail and make the case for himself. The thing with the awareness of voters, Republican voters, when it comes to Donald Trump, their kind of field of awareness and understanding of him is about a mile wide and a mile deep. With Ron DeSantis, it might be about 3/4 of a mile wide and maybe an inch or a foot deep. And so it's going to be just incumbent on DeSantis to be able to expand both the depth and the width of it. He's got the money. He has the background. And if you look at his 2022 re-election campaign, he does have the ability to win. Now, the reality is Donald Trump is a very different animal in a Republican primary than DeSantis' opponent was when his re-election was last year against Charlie Crist. So we're just going to have to wait and see.
Donald Trump is formidable on the campaign trail. Julia, I want to get your reaction to something. The New York Times editorial board over the weekend warned President Biden not to pretend that age is not an issue. They wrote, Biden will need to provide explicit reassurance to voters. Many of them have seen family members decline rapidly in their 80s. Americans are watching what Biden says and does as he asked them to do. It's uncomfortable, but it's reality.
Absolutely, and it's reality when you are serving in one of the most mentally and physically strenuous jobs in the entire world, the President of the United States. And I thought it was really interesting today when at the White House briefing, a reporter asks the White House press secretary if Biden will serve out his term. And, the press secretary said, well, that's up to President Biden. So it's something he's going to be asked about, not only from us in the media, but also on from voters on the trail. I'm assuming, the Biden campaign's going to get a lot of that feedback. So they need to get their messaging right on this because it's a legitimate question for him, as it is a legitimate question for someone like Donald Trump, who's a few years younger. Last week, Elizabeth, or a couple of weeks ago, we were talking so much about Dianne Feinstein and, the calls for her to resign. And obviously, those are two separate situations. However, the fact of the matter is, in politics in the U.S., we have all of these older people well into their 80s serving in these positions, and there are questions as to whether they should, how long they should be in these positions for, whether it's the presidency or Congress. It's a legitimate question, and I think as you see figures like Biden and Feinstein in the media or in the news because of their age, we're going to be talking about it more at a national.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider, and don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.